Okay, so we'll be doing trauma as a barrier to intelligence and learning. This video is, as I said earlier, an example of what I expect you to do as you complete your assignment on barriers to learning. But I also want you to look at this video keeping in mind that you may be faced with many situations in your classroom, around in your community, possibly in your family or friend circles, where trauma may emerge as something that a person is struggling with. And so I think I'm going to try to make this as in-depth as possible. I've written quite a bit about this topic, so a lot of this video will be me going through what I've written, the points that I want you to be very clear on. You are welcome to email me with questions, but this is going to be quite an intense video on trauma. So people with people that are intelligent or people that are able to do things in a specific way, trauma definitely can act as a barrier to them expressing their intelligence and of course prevent them from learning effectively. And we'll find out why as we progress. So of course we always start with a definition and the definition of trauma. So I want to first make something quite clear. Sometimes people call trauma stress or stress trauma, so they get the two confused. In reality, these are very, very different. Trauma and post-trauma or post-traumatic symptoms are things that you relive over and over again. It sits in your imagination, in your dreams. It basically impedes or makes it difficult for you to live your life. Whereas stress, you often do still have that feeling of control. Whereas in trauma, you feel like everything is out of control. You have no ability to make any difference in your life. You feel completely out of control. So I've used two definitions here. The Sittler article I have provided for you, so you can read that article. And then I've also used a definition from the APA or American Psychological Association. So the first one talks about trauma being an affliction of the powerless. So essentially it makes the victim feel powerless. It makes you feel like you don't have any choice in the matter. It makes you feel out of control. It's about chaos. Okay, so the victim is rendered helpless by overwhelming forces. Traumatic events overwhelm the ordinary system of care that give a person a sense of control, connection, and meaning. That is what Herman 1997 said, and it was cited in Sittler 2008. According to the APA, trauma is defined as an emotional response to a terrible event like an accident, rape, or abuse, or natural disasters. Immediately after the event, shock and denial are typical. Longer-term reactions include unpredictable emotions, flashbacks, strained relationships, and even physical symptoms like headaches or nausea. But we'll discuss this a little bit more as the video progresses. Okay, so trauma is quite broad, but there are different types of trauma. So I want you to remember that I said I've written quite a bit about this, so I'm going to take you through it as much as I can. So it does get a little bit, just of you kind of listening to me reading or explaining what I've written down, but I hope that it'll help you to make sense a little bit of what we are going through. So we're going to start with chronic trauma, which is the first type that is put down here. So chronic trauma, this type of trauma is more consistent, prolonged, repetitive, and usually occurs over a long period of time. And it's linked to specific contact relationships, which could include family violence, intimate partner violence, and so on. So chronic trauma would possibly be in a case of domestic abuse, where there is violence within the family. So chronic means it's consistent, it goes on for quite a number of years or quite a long time. We then have complex trauma, which refers to exposure to multiple types of trauma and traumatic events, which are very invasive and interpersonal in nature. So it could be that you have there's various types of abuse or various types of traumatic events which you're exposed to. So you could be experiencing violence within the home as you're growing up with your family, and then also with a boyfriend or a girlfriend would be more trauma, so it makes it more complex. You'd also be bullied at school, for example. You may have been in an accident, so your trauma is quite complex because it's in so many different contexts and over such a long period of time. We then have developmental trauma, which when you work with kids is something that you may see. So developmental trauma occurs during the developmental period. So the significant period where development takes place in a child's life or in a person's life. So this is specifically during childhood or adolescence or in the intermediate phase, which we are focusing on, and usually within the microsystem. So if we think of Bronfenbrenner, the microsystem of the child is, or of the environment, is the closest to the child. So it's peers, family, friends, cousins, neighbors, and so on. So this type of trauma starts early in the child's life and continues for extensive period of time. And it has a definite and profound effect on the development, on the attachment, which you remember attachment that we spoke about, or we're going to speak about later on, sorry. Later on in your module we'll speak about attachment. Trauma has quite an effect on development, on the way our brain develops, and on attachment, which is an important part of growing up, and also on functioning, on day-to-day functioning. So examples of this can be abuse of all types, abandonment, violence or loss, etc. Okay, so then acute trauma. Acute trauma focuses on an experience like a singular traumatic event, something big that happens in your life that makes you as an individual feel powerless, as if you have no control. It's like a threat on your life, or it's just basically overwhelms you as a person in a very physiological way, a physical way, in a mental way, in every type of way. So according to Jaff, Siegel and Dumka in 2005, this type of single traumatic event has three elements that we need to pay attention to. So firstly, the event was unexpected, something that just came out of the blue. You were as the person were unprepared, and there was nothing that you could have done to avoid or prevent it from happening. And this I found in Naidu and Ramlal 2016. So that is your acute trauma. We then move on to vicarious trauma or secondary trauma. This may be experienced by first responders, so people like paramedics, like medical staff, like police, even counselors. So it occurs when an individual has, you don't necessarily witness the event, you weren't there when the traumatic event didn't happen to you, but essentially you integrate the disturbing aspects of this event into your own functioning. So even if something happens to a child's parent or to their caregiver or to a friend, they could experience vicarious or secondary trauma, and then it will be expressed in ways they might have nightmares about it. They might hold on tight to the person because they're scared something's going to happen to the person. So that is your secondary or vicarious trauma. We then have historical or intergenerational trauma, and this type of trauma is definitely evident in our landscape in the South African context. So it's an emotional and psychological trauma that affects not just individuals, but also groups as a whole. So the group could be in terms of communities, cultural or ethnic groups, and even generations. So in our context, in South African context, we'll be referring to the forced segregation. We'll be talking about apartheid, the oppression of people within the country, the oppression of people to move around freely, the abuse, the torture, the forced, of course, imprisonment is always forced, but basically the imprisonment and forced kind of removals of families and communities, which is very traumatic, of course. So this type of trauma includes racism, colonization, loss of culture, like I said, the removal of families and communities, slavery, genocide, and war. So all of these things come together. So coping and adaptation patterns developed in response to trauma can be passed through generations. So because at the time you were going through that traumatic event, whatever kind of coping patterns or coping strategies you put into place, this gets passed on to your families as the years, as time goes on. So a simple example, there was a lot of fear for police during apartheid, the deep fear. And so oftentimes you'll see people have passed that down to the children, that if you don't listen, I'm going to call the police. So you create that kind of fear in the child. So there's a lot of examples in our societies, especially related to apartheid, that you can see these types of beliefs, ideologies have been consciously or unconsciously passed from generation to generation. And you have to be aware of it to actually try to break these cycles. So that's when we talk about historical and intergenerational trauma does get passed on. Then the next one is disaster. So this type of trauma occurs when a large number of people are exposed to natural disasters such as floods, pandemics, such as the current pandemic we are facing, which is COVID-19, things like tsunamis, droughts, which are debilitating. These can all be a type of trauma that you experience. The effects of this kind of trauma are extreme and have many long-term effects such as displacement, loss of family and friends, feeling unsafe and anxious about the future. Then we have trauma due to political violence, and this type of trauma is attributed to widespread political unrest and violence that affects a large number of people. Example of this include, but obviously it's not limited to, I'm just giving you some examples. So it could be things like political hijacking, it could be mass murders, xenophobic attacks, war, guerrilla warfare, in particular, and various types of torture and starvation and so on and so forth. So these are the types. This is not, of course, a exhaustive list, but these are some of the categories that do exist. So various subcategories have been created, some overlap and some which do not necessarily meet the criteria of trauma, but they've been spoken about as traumatic. I want to bring in here that the word trauma is often thrown around in situations which sometimes are not necessarily traumatic. Although it's very painful, breakups and losing your job, etc., under normal circumstances are not necessarily traumatic. They are a heartbreak, they are a painful situation, they require grieving, it is a stressor, definitely. But if these are consistent and they are enveloped by many other traumatic events, you can then say yes, the person has been traumatized because it's consistent, complex types of trauma. So we need to be clear about what constitutes trauma and what is part of a normal life cycle. So it's important to start with defining the parameters of what we consider to be trauma. We overuse the word sometimes. Sometimes we say that an exam is traumatic. We sometimes say that it was traumatic because I had to rush to work, or whatever the case is. We run the risk of really understanding trauma in its purest sense if we overuse the word, because trauma is something which occurs outside of a normal human experience. Not all deaths are traumatic, for example. Sometimes as part of the normal life cycle, someone gets quite old, they lived a good and healthy life, and they do die. We can be prepared for that as a human being. But trauma is very specific. It's something that leaves you feeling out of control, completely, you know, feeling as if you are completely powerless. So that is something that we need to keep in mind. Is PTSD the same thing as trauma? So the main difference between PTSD and the experience of trauma is important to note. It's about time-based. So traumatic event is time-based. So PTSD is longer-term condition where you continue to have flashbacks and you re-experience the trauma over and over. That is PTSD. It's post-traumatic stress disorder, where the trauma keeps coming back up, causes you stress, causes you anxiety, and the traumatic event keeps replaying in your head. And that is what we call PTSD. It happens after the traumatic event. A traumatic event, for example, could be a horrendous car crash, and the flashbacks, the feeling of feeling of being sick, the feelings of not being able to cope, those are all the symptoms of the PTSD because it happens after the traumatic event. So what are some of the symptoms of PTSD? They can be grouped into 4 distinct categories as I've put them down here. So you could have intrusive memories, and those are some of the examples. So you could have things as kind of recurrent thoughts that keep coming over and over and over to you. They cause some type of distress for you. That can be nightmares. That just these memories just don't want to go away. It's with you all the time. Then avoidance, you try not to think about it. You don't want to see anybody that reminds you of it. If you see pictures about, something that is related to that event, you feel sick, you just want to avoid it as much as possible. That can be, that's definitely one of the categories as well. And then negative changes in thinking and mood. So you feel hopeless, you feel detached, you feel numb, you're unable to do things you usually could do. You don't want to maintain relationships in the same way. Then there's changes in physical and emotional reactions or your arousal symptoms. So you're either hyper aroused or hyper vigilant, on you on a like an energetic response all the time, just like someone will give you a fright and you're ready to fight, and you are just hyper vigilant, you overwhelmingly alert. You have trouble sleeping, you can't concentrate, you can't rest, you just are aggressive and just like a firecracker all the time. This could be part of the arousal symptoms, because your fight or flight, which we'll talk about later, your ability to respond to anything in your environment is on hyper alert. Then for children under 6, they may reenact the trauma. They have nightmares, or they may talk about it a lot, talk about the traumatic event. They may have play it out all the time. If the traumatic event was a car crash, like I said earlier, they'll play it out with their toys and their cars and their dolls, and they keep doing it over and over and over, because this is how children deal with traumatic events. They talk about it, they draw it, they play it, they sing it, they have nightmares about it, they think about it. That is how trauma gets or emerges with children, especially under the age of 6 years. We've come to the end of this first video, and I've spoken quite a bit. We'll continue in the next video.